Thank you. I live in Meeple, right in the middle of this wonderful landscape, which everybody should know more about. If you drive from Ely to Chatteris, you run off the end of the high land quite fast at Meeple. We've got a hill. This is the Fen Hill. And you drive across 7 or 8 miles of extremely prosperous looking, very neatly kept arable land. And left and right, there's a tremendous expanse. And I stand, can I do this? No, I can't, I've got to tell it to that. I stand at Meeple Bridge, which if we're really lucky, I might be able to point to. Good grief, can you see anything on there at all? I stand at Meeple Bridge. Oops. I stand at Meeple Bridge and look across to Chatteris and try to imagine what that can possibly have been like. It's a very long way. I can see how far it is now because there's a wind farm about there. And that was all fen. The highway wasn't there. Wasn't there until absolutely major change was undertaken in a period of just over 20 years, between 1630 and 1653. And of course, finishing that in 1653 was really only just the start. I'm sorry we haven't got anybody here to talk about maintenance after 1653, because I think the civil engineering story of the Fen is absolutely fantastic, and I can't do that. Maintaining it is still something that's actively done today, and I'm very grateful when I see people driving down the barrier bank, making sure that I don't get flooded because it comes through at my bit. I want to talk about that change, and I think it would be helpful. I entirely agree with Sue that you shouldn't just believe what your mother told you. It'd be just useful to set out what it is we're talking about. So the broad outline of those 20 years first. The project started in 1631 with an agreement between the Commissioners of Sewers, which were the people who look after the area, the drainage, traditionally, with the Earl of Bedford, Francis Russell, 4th Earl. The whole area, known as the Bedford Level, was going to be drained. That's the agreement. I don't expect you to read it. I'll be moving it soon. It's an area of about 20 square miles, over 300,000 acres, and for doing it, he was to have 95,000 acres, except that 40,000 acres were going to be reserved for maintenance in perpetuity, and 12,000 were going to be Charles I's, because in the past he'd got an interest which had in fact been given to his father. So he says, that's negated, I'll have 12,000 when you've just done it. In the following February, Bedford agreed with 13 others to share the costs, and the old Bedford River was by 1636 dug. Other cuts and sluices had been made at the east end, the top end of the rivers, northeast, where they flow out into the Wash, and the level was declared drained. Now that's the first phase of what often is seen as 2 phases of drainage, and in fact I think really it's easier to see it as 3. That's the phase when Russell is in charge of the drainage. He's got 13 partners, because that's how they do it. There are significant complaints about whether the drainage is complete or not. There are all sorts of other political motives, I'm sure, for non-completion, including the fact that people in the area didn't much like it, especially when people moved onto their land and started staking it out and moving their cow over. And the declaration of the commissioners that the land had been drained is reversed in 1639. We then come to the second stage, because that's the point at which Charles I says, okay, I'll do it. Perhaps I can make some money out of this. I've been trying to make it in all sorts of other ways. This might work. But in fact, he'd got a little problem with the Scots. He gets Cornelius Vermuyden to direct it, and that's the second time that Vermuyden comes into the story. But he didn't do the first bit. We've already heard about other people doing the design for the first bit, and he didn't, almost certainly wasn't involved in that first phase. Second phase is very short, because the trouble with the Scots and the trouble in England leads in 1642, as you know, to Charles I raising his standard against his own countrymen. And it's only when that settles down that pushing the wrong thing. That's Vermuyden. down there, giving some instructions for some of the drainage up north. Nasty, crabby hand. And after making representations in Parliament from 1645-6 onwards, in 1649, almost certainly with Cromwell's help, the Protector's help, because you need strong government to do a big project like this, get what is afterwards called the Pretended Act, and the third phase begins. Third phase, Vermuyden is asked. There's a lot of wrangling about what he's going to get for doing it, but he is asked to direct it. They get on, he makes the second river, he is the progenitor of the washes, and I don't think anybody else had thought of that first. So, insofar as this is the Ouse Washes Partnership, it's all his fault. But the basic idea was somebody else's. By 1651, we've got the first part, the north and middle levels drained, and by 1653, the south level. And if you want to believe that there were lots and lots of Cornishmen and Dutchmen and Scotsmen rushing around the drainage areas, there were some after the Battle of Dunbar, so by 1651, but probably between 500 and 1,000, a minority. And there are some Dutchmen after we win the first battle of the Dutch Wars in 1652, so they're mostly in the south level. That's the bare bones. I pointed at the wrong thing all the time. Let's go back to my map. Big, big, big expanses of fen. Back to my big expanse of fen across there. Intercommon, we saw a very nice diagram of how the intercommon worked. All these people up and down here, those people over there, sharing that space. And the fen is very, very rich. Lots and lots of interests sitting in it. You can see that really nicely, the way that it's a mixed farming, using the uplands, using the fen together here at Sutton-Bury. And one of the people who later puts money into the fens also has the sense to buy that during the interregnum when the bishop's lands are sold. That's the house. It's been there since the 13th century. Those of you who are building archaeologists will immediately be able to see that that yellow bit is 13th century. There's a bit of window there. And that's why it's important. You can see the yellow again. And there's that nice way onto the upland, down onto the fen, seen here from the Sutton Galt, the Sutton-Earith road. We've heard what goods the fen could provide. But however rich it was, there's always sometimes need to nibble at the edges. Probably to create those meadows that Sue told us about so very interestingly. And she had a nice map showing 1636, some intakes just north of Coveney. And it is mostly for meadowland, and it's mostly nibbling at the edges of the fen. This is an absolutely major change. So what happens that makes it possible at this time? First of all, for the first time for a long time, we've got firmly rising population. There's clearly pressure on land in England. Probably more importantly, there's a political awareness. There's an awareness internationally, which Nick James has talked about much more eloquently than I could, about the potential of skill and mathematics. But in the fen itself, there's a willingness to break with tradition, and I think this comes out of Rigidus Reformation and the political and the theological aspects of change, which that meant for everybody, from the landowners, we don't really have gentry, but from the yeoman farmers, the manorial lords, down to ordinary people whose lives have been upset by this swinging backwards and forwards, where religion, the fate of your soul, becomes a political football, if you like. We've got, without a doubt, a growth of markets, and we've got increasingly practiced channels for handing down word of information from the centre in London to the local area. So that when Miles Sands, soon to be knighted, buys the manor of Willingham in 1601, and by asserting what he sees as his rights of lord of the manor, annoys tremendously his tenants. His descriptions of what they do is quite amazing, including, interestingly, saying that they'll chase his men and get them to be pressed as soldiers, which I think is nice. But when he petitions the Queen, complaining about all that, yeoman farmers and the people on Willingham Fen know how to petition back. So we've got a real political awareness which is going to give us some of this famed disagreement that they're still talking about, so they tell me, in the pubs. The relationship of the upper classes with the court had, of course, very often been a personal one. A lot of people who made any money were courtiers. They didn't actually speak to the king, at least they stood in the same room as him. And there's a growing feeling of equality, which is, I think, worked out very much in Soham. In Soham, there's a new tenant, Sir Robert Heath, who, like Sir Miles Sarnes, is exerting his rights, and they don't like it. And when Queen Henrietta Maria's carriage crosses from Newmarket through Soham to Ely in 1633, she's actually stopped by them because they'd like to hand over a petition themselves to say this shouldn't be happening. Charles I didn't actually share their view of whether they should be speaking personally to his queen. Alongside this growing awareness that people could speak up for themselves, we've got a technological revolution which becomes more and more important. Printing. It had been a catalyst for the reformed religious belief, and pamphlet printing is a major source of information and disinformation, which much more work could be done on in this whole period in the Fen. And it is a source of disinformation, and it's another one of those areas where we tend to see the rioters as immensely riotous people, because that's how sometimes they want to depict themselves, and somehow that's how the attacked wish to see them depicted. There is no doubt that there's violence in places, but we can overdo it. Changes in vision, as Nick has shown us, affected the prosperous. Affected the prosperous in their pockets. The focus of trade had shifted over the past 100, 150 years to the north, from Venice and the Italian cities, up to Bruges, then Antwerp, and then across this period, as the Scheldt is closed, up to Amsterdam. And all that trade brought a new prosperity. And together with the voyages of discovery across the Atlantic, it simply widens men's horizons and gives you a belief, gives people a belief in the value of wealth creation, the turning of wastelands into sources of profit. Expectation was very buoyant. As I say, population's rising, and we can see that certainly in March and on the big fens in Soham. There are more people pushing for more, many more tenants have only some waste and a little backyard, again, as Sue was saying. There's land use change because internal markets are growing, so there's more money in the countryside. Soham people had been told since the early 15th century not to sell things outside the manor. They're actually taking turf and sedge to Stourbridge Fair and beyond. And by the beginning of the 17th century, they're beginning to sell dairy products, whether in London or whether only in Newmarket in the courts there, I don't really know. It's interesting that both in Willingham and Soham, which are probably the biggest examples of discontent, the beginnings of enclosure and drainage by the landlords, discontent locally, they're places of very weak lordship. In Soham, it had been a Duchy of Lancaster manor, and Heath, who takes over, tries really to turn back the clock. Willingham had tremendous own self-regulation. We've got the Fen Reeves accounts, which have survived miraculously, saved in the parish chest, no doubt because of the arguments about what should be happening to their fen. Could do with a lot, they've been used quite a lot, but more minute understanding of them, particularly in light of the sort of things that Sue was saying, would be really interesting. They survived from 1567 to 1605. And they show people, for themselves, not as manorial tenants, organising the commons for their own good in a very, very complex way. Willingham had been a bishop's manor. It had been leased, the domain had been leased since at least the 1480s. And then, of course, between the death of Bishop Cox in 1581, there's a wrangle between potential bishops and the Crown, because the Crown wants to effect an exchange. And basically Willingham only goes to the Crown in 1600 and is sold straight on to Sarnes. Sarnes also has an ecclesiastical background. His father was an Archbishop of York. He managed in his time as Archbishop to set up several sons in really quite a decent way. There could be profits in the church. We've got a greatly stimulated man market, which has really started with the suppression of the monasteries probably. And it's for a long time been the case that profits of a legal career and of royal favour could be put back into land. That's been happening since the 14th century in Cambridgeshire, and that was causing no specific difficulty. But the new men who found themselves buying land in the 16th century, then in the 17th century, like Sarnes from the Crown, did so in a new environment. They were aware of the potential for investment to increase their income. All landowners, we saw Nick's nice slide, which I had one that went back further to show how prices had risen up until then. Prices of goods had risen, rents hadn't. Exploiting the land was no doubt very much easier if you hadn't got any family background in that area, and it was even better if you didn't actually live there. Sir Robert Heath lived at Mitcham in Surrey till 1633 and then bought a fine new house in Kent. He knew about Soham, but he fulfills this idea. He doesn't really know actually on the ground what it's like, though he knows enough to be able to talk about coping with draining the mere. We've heard how the land drainage, Mr. Hunt is the man who thinks about, for the Crown, from the centre, beginning to think about how the fen could be drained. This wonderful realisation. You can just about see the line across there, where the rivers are going to go, which is on the 1604 map. That's his line, which is the line that's eventually dug. We've had various Dutchmen come in various places to help with draining the fen. There's been this very, very sad, difficult attempt to drain Hatfield Chase, Isle of Axholme, which seems really good. Sir Cornelius Vermuyden gets knighted. He's done what the Crown wanted. It was mostly Crown land. That's quite helpful too. They had the majority rights. And then it all goes hopelessly, hopelessly wrong. But in 1630, eventually, using the Great Drainage Act, the commissioners decide get sorted out, get their agreement with Russell to drain. I think it's, that's the area. What have I done to it? That was going to be, go back one. Thank you. That was going to be the area he drained. That is the area he's drained. And the red land is the adventure land, the land the adventurers were going to get for draining it. Place it wouldn't have been the last one, but it's quite clever, really, wasn't it? Never mind. The thing that's really interesting is where that money comes from. We've got those 14 partners. Some of them, obviously, were people who were really up for the idea of drainage, but they're relatively local people. They're commissioners of sewers. They're not just the men from London. We've got Fanati. I'm delighted, thank you, Nick, for telling me that he was Genoese, who is investing money that he almost certainly doesn't have. This is an area that I find extremely intriguing. There's an area that a lot of more work could be done. At the beginning, we have the 14 partners for the first scheme. Others take over in 1649. By the time Jonas Moore publishes his celebratory map in 1658, he puts the shields, coats of arms of 80-something people around it. And those 80 people are only those who have got an interest just at that moment. There's a lot about the growing sophistication of a very unsophisticated financial system that's interesting there. A little bit more about it can be done from advertising. I'm about to advertise the fact that the Cambridgeshire Record Society, who have just published the Ely Scoutcher book, which Sue has been instrumental in bringing to publication, Ted Miller's transcript, will next year publish Francis Wilmot's work on Moore's 1658 map. And I've contributed biographies, partial biographies of those 80-something people. And that begins to allow us to see what sort of people are investing in the drainage. But it only begins because, having looked at that from the records of the Bedford Level Corporation, which are fantastic in Cambridgeshire Archives, I can see that we can get very many more names out, and we can perhaps start to see how this capital starts to shift. Lots of London lawyers in there, lots of money coming, interestingly, from the Somerset, Bristol area. Some from people who actually wanted to live here, like Samuel Fortree, who landed up at Fortree Hall. So here we are, back to Meeple, it's just across the river. Some sort of a background. Thank you.